Thanks for the opportunity of talking to you a little bit about COVID-19 vaccines and providing you with an update. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the current COVID-19 status and why getting a vaccine going quickly is so important. We'll get into some vaccine basics and talk about the specific approaches for vaccines towards COVID-19. I'll focus a bit on safety and efficacy, a little bit on the rollout strategy, and then some other factors for consideration as we embark on the journey of vaccinating as many people as we can in North America and the rest of the world. So the current slide is looking at the US daily cases as of January the 8th, in which we can see the trend of COVID-19 cases going back to the beginning of March last year, and the three waves and very clear high numbers of cases that we're getting on a daily basis, approaching 300,000 new cases per day in the US. Thus making it really critical that we continue to implement controls and look for new ways to control the risks. And my general view of the role of the vaccine is to use it as one more tool in the toolbox to help control the risks of the spread and also the infectivity and the severity of COVID-19 disease. So let's begin with a few vaccine basics. And vaccines essentially contain microbes or part of microbes that produce disease. Vaccines have been used for decades in terms of disease prevention and reduction and management. A vaccine is essentially designed to imitate the disease that it's trying to protect. But that imitation shouldn't actually cause the disease. It's a fairly straightforward concept. The human immune system then sees the vaccine as the real disease and generates a protective immune response to that disease, but it doesn't actually cause the disease. So a successful vaccination program will protect the person from future exposure to the real disease. So in essence, that's what we're trying to do here, is to create a vaccine that imitates the disease but doesn't cause the disease and results in a robust immune response to protect the vaccinee from a future exposure. So how does that apply to the virus that causes COVID-19 disease? What you can see is a simple image of the virus SARS-CoV-2 that causes the COVID-19 disease. And I want to point out a couple of factors. Essentially, the virus is a sphere made up of fat and protein that contains genetic material, but some key points on the surface are shown on this slide. I'm sure many of you have heard of the spike proteins, and that's a major target of vaccines. And this slide shows essentially the spike proteins, which are the red structures on top of the virus, which you can see here, the image of the virus. So we have S proteins, we have E proteins, we have M proteins. I'm not going to get into the details, but the point here is that we're trying to imitate this structure in the context of the vaccine, and there's different ways to do it. There are essentially 4 different approaches or types of vaccine that are either in development or being used today. And I'm going to just very quickly outline what those 4 are. The first, and essentially the simplest, is to use whole virus that's been somehow attenuated or altered so it doesn't cause the disease. This is an approach that's been used for years in relation to infectious diseases, and it works very well. So approach 1 is just to have a whole virus and to somehow alter it so it doesn't cause the disease. The second approach is to use a part of the virus. And the target for that is the spike protein that we looked at on the last slide. So it's a protein subunit of the virus. It's a piece of the virus. So that's the second approach. The third approach is to use nucleic acid or genetic materials. And particularly currently, the focus there is on something called messenger RNA, or mRNA for short. The mRNA from the virus is then packaged in a specific delivery way and delivered to human cells. And the human cells are then used to create new proteins that are actually viral proteins that the human immune system sees and reacts to. So that's the third approach. And that's the approach that the 2 vaccines that are currently being used in the United States, Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, that's the approach they're taking. They're using the mRNA approach. The fourth is to use a different, what is called viral vector. So in other words, we're going to put the genes for the COVID-19 virus into a different virus, such as an adenovirus, and you're using a virus that's essentially harmless to humans, but it is sort of the Trojan horse in which to deliver the message to the human cells, the COVID-19 genetic material. So those are the four approaches that are out there. And there's research and development going on in all four of those key areas. But I'm going to focus particularly on the third one, the mRNA approach, which is the one that Pfizer and Moderna have developed and is being used today in the US. So how does this mRNA vaccine work? But essentially what you're doing is you are injecting into the muscle in somebody's arm a complex of fat and genetic material in the form of mRNA. So from the injection site over there on the right-hand side of the graphic, what one can see is that this mRNA, which is the little squiggle there on the top left of the graphic on the right, that gets into the muscle cell, which is the pink structure over there on the right. That messenger RNA gets into the muscle cell in the human host after the injection. And the human cell then translates that message, that genetic material, into proteins, which are then put together inside the human cell. And this graphic is showing the messenger RNA translating into those blue structures, which are then migrating out of the human cell and onto the surface of the cell. Obviously, those protein structures are foreign to the human, and as such, generate the immune response. So the messenger RNA is essentially creating like mini spike proteins. So the whole approach here, it doesn't introduce infectious virus. It doesn't introduce the virus itself. It is simply introducing the genetic material, which is then used to create new proteins, which our immune system sees, so that when we get exposed to the real virus, we have a pre-programmed, pre-built immune response to the virus. And that's basically the way in which the mRNA vaccines are working. So as I already mentioned, we have two vaccines in the US that are currently being used. Both are these mRNA vaccines. They both received FDA emergency use authorization, as I'm sure you're well aware. And the Pfizer vaccine was the first onto the market. This was approved in mid-December. The Moderna vaccine came a couple of weeks later. So what do we know about the efficacy of these two vaccines? Well, the Pfizer vaccine was studied for a couple of months in multiple different countries. About 44,000 people were vaccinated. Roughly half of them got vaccine and half of them got placebo, which was essentially an injection of something other than the vaccine. The results of that study, out of that 44,000 people study, showed that there was approximately a 95% efficiency or efficacy for prevention of symptomatic COVID infection. The study looked at individuals of 16 years and older. So we know that in 16 years and above, this vaccine has about a 95% efficacy. The tough part about this particular vaccine is it has to be stored at minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit, which creates serious logistic challenges with transport and use. The other vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, also a large study, just over 30,000. You can see the breakdown there. Roughly 15,000 got the vaccine, 15,000 got the placebo. And there we got a 94.1% efficacy for prevention of symptomatic infection. The Moderna study was done in 18 years and older. It's a little logistically easier to store at minus 4 Fahrenheit, but it still has to be kept frozen. And that's largely because these mRNA vaccines are pretty unstable, so they need to be kept at cold temperatures. So they're effective. These two vaccines are effective in the studies. What do we know about safety? Overall, the vaccines were considered safe. If they weren't, they wouldn't have got the emergency use authorization from the FDA. There were some local reactions at the time of injection, sore arm, minor fevers, some aches and pains, but nothing significant. And the serious reactions were minimal during the course of the study. Since the Pfizer vaccine has been rolled out in mid-December, we have become aware of some acute allergic reactions in some people at around about a rate of 11 or so acute allergic reactions per million doses of the vaccine, which is low, but nevertheless important. And that's one of the reasons why these vaccines should be administered in a medical facility. There are other vaccines on the horizon. At least 50 other vaccines are in development using one of the 4 different strategies that I talked about earlier. The one that is probably most current is one made by AstraZeneca. It was created through a combination of AstraZeneca and Oxford University. That is now approved in the UK. We don't know quite as much about that one. It's approximately 90% effective, but the studies are still ongoing to really look at its effectiveness. It's using a modified chimpanzee virus, a chimpanzee adenovirus, which is basically harmless to humans, but that's the way in which this genetic material is delivered. So you would actually administer a virus to the humans, again, through an injection. And it is delivering the genetic material, which is then translated, much as we looked at earlier with the mRNA vaccines. So the human cells, once they're exposed to this adenovirus, they make the COVID-19 proteins. The immune system sees those proteins and creates an immune response. The good news about the AstraZeneca vaccine is that it is much more stable. It can be stored at regular refrigeration temperatures of around 40 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 6 months, which makes distribution a whole lot simpler and easier to deal with. So what's the rollout strategy in North America with these vaccines? There's an advisory committee called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Strategy, or ACIP, that is administered and run by the Centers for Disease Control that came up with a tiered rollout. Phase 1A, which involves healthcare personnel and long-term care facility residents. Phase 1B, which are elderly over 75 and frontline essential workers. And Phase 1C, which are those between the age of 65 and 74, or those younger with high-risk medical conditions and other essential workers. Essentially, the rollout strategy was defined by this committee, ACIP, but it's effectively being driven at the state and local level. The state and local authorities are making the decisions about exactly the priorities and the logistics. So essentially, healthcare personnel and long-term care facilities are getting it first. Many frontline essential workers will get it as part of Phase 1B. So who are frontline essential workers? And that's shown on this slide. Won't go through all the details here. You can see this, but essentially we've got firefighters, we've got correction officers, we've got food and agriculture, manufacturing, transit, education, daycare workers. So this whole group comprises many, many millions of individuals. Probably close to about 80 to 83, 85 million people across the country. So there's a lot of frontline essential workers that are part of the 1B strategy. There are some other factors to consider. As I've mentioned, the 2 vaccine candidates that are being used in the US have been shown to reduce the severity of COVID-19. There's no data yet on whether they actually reduce transmission of the virus. So because of that, when you have been vaccinated, we need to continue with the other prevention strategies, the mask, social distancing requirements. So masks, social distancing, other factors are important. We do need to make sure that we continue to do that even in those who've been vaccinated until we've learned more. The vaccines, as I've mentioned, need to be administered in a medical facility, and we've got a robust surveillance system in place to look for adverse events. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there are new COVID variants that have emerged in the UK, B117, or South Africa, B501V2. So far, the indications are that the vaccine will work against those variants, but we've got to wait and see to be sure. In summary, the new vaccines that are being used, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine in the US, show a high level of efficacy. They work. They reduce the severity of the disease. There is a question on impact on viral transmission that we'll have to watch. Rollout plan that I've talked about is being executed with these tiered priorities, and certainly you need to check in with your state and local health authorities as to just how they impact you at the state and local level. It is important to continue with the current controls. As I said, the vaccine is part of the toolkit. Right now, it isn't the sole answer, so we have to keep up our vigilance on the other control systems. And obviously be ready for the impact of new COVID virus variants that may appear on the scene. So with that, I'd like to thank you and certainly look forward to some questions. Thanks.